You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 2nd of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, the latest from Syria as Bashar al-Assad, with help from Russia, tries to claw back control of Aleppo from rebel fighters. Also coming up, Ukraine's president refreshes and renews his call to join NATO. What could have changed to grant his wish?
But if we want to stop the hot stage of the war, we should take under NATO umbrella the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control.
We'll also have the latest from Iceland, where this weekend's elections have heralded another change in government, and
we have 2.9 million people, and that's 2.9 gems. And so there are 2.9 gems that is there waiting for you when you come to Jamaica.
We hear from Jamaica's tourism minister, who perhaps has the easiest sales job on earth. Plus the business news and why France is struggling to fill its Santa slots. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The US President Joe Biden has issued an official pardon for his son Hunter, despite previously saying he'd neither pardon him nor commute his sentence. The chief executive of the world's fourth largest car maker, Stellantis, has resigned. And Oxford University Press has revealed its word or phrase of the year is brain rot. It describes an individual's intellectual state after consuming too much trivial material on social media. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, between 2011 and 2016, the Free Syrian Army battled government forces for control of the second city of Aleppo. They didn't succeed. Last week, in the space of 3 days, rebels achieved what the Free Syrian Army failed to do. And they've not only taken Aleppo, but are now reportedly pushing southward. Well, I'm joined now by Daniela Pellet, who's managing editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Welcome back, Daniela. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Everybody has been taken by surprise, haven't they? Russia included.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's important to remember this is a very salutary reminder that conflicts don't end just because international attention drifts away. You know, the situation in Syria has continued to be appalling for many, many civilians. It's the country itself is controlled by a patchwork of different groups, from the regime in the west to Turkish allied forces in the north and Kurdish forces as well. And well, we look back to the revolution in 2011. I mean, that was driven by demands for democracy, human rights, freedom, and this isn't what's happening now, to put it brutally. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Islamist group leading this onslaught, they're prescribed by the US as a terror group. They grew out of Jabhat al-Nusra, basically Al-Qaeda in Syria. This isn't preparation for sort of new democratic rule in Syria, but it is extremely significant, and it's also significant to see that the way that HTS are behaving as they're taking new ground.
In what way are they behaving that is interesting? Because this is something that has happened incredibly quickly, and one wonders where their strength and their backing has come from to allow them to mobilise at such speed.
Well, I mean, quietly they have been actually preparing for this kind of offensive. I'm sure everyone is surprised, including them, but they have been training for the last couple of years very intensely. They have their own sort of special forces units dedicated to nighttime operations or covert operations. You know, they don't have air force, but again, you know, it's an argument, who needs air forces these days, really, when you could do so much with drones. So although it was a shock, as I said, you know, they're a significant force. And also in recent years, in the parts of Syria that it controls, I mean, it's been trying to act with some success, I guess, as a government, providing services and so on. And its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, made very public orders that his forces need to respect civilians. There is a mixture of religions and ethnicities in Aleppo, and there's been all kinds of stories of people saying, "Oh, the Christians haven't had to take their Christmas trees down," and so on and so forth. So it's not as black and white as it might seem on the surface.
Have people taken their eye off the ball because of conflicts elsewhere and lacked focus on Syria? And by which I mean not just the outside world, but when you look at all the players in the Middle East, you have Israel, you have Iran, and you have Russia as well helping Syria. Was there an opportunity that the rebels could see?
Well, I've no doubt that this is, no accident that this came as Israel and Lebanon agreed a ceasefire. This and this means, this is a serious implications for Assad. So Assad has always relied on outside support, especially in Aleppo. The battle for Aleppo in 2016 was won with the help of Russia's air force and Iranian-supported forces. But obviously Russia is heavily distracted elsewhere in Ukraine, and it's unclear how much resources it can provide. It's been running some airstrikes over the last few days, but it's seriously limited. Hezbollah and Iran have been, again, seriously weakened and distracted by fighting with Israel. And regional players have, as ever, wanted to try and find stability. Don't forget there's a huge refugee crisis still in many of the neighbouring countries. They would quite like Syria to be stable so people would return. Turkey has been talking about a refresh of relations given the importance of seeking regional stability, as they put it. So it has been in the regional interest to have a level of stability. Of course, as I said, stability does not mean human rights for the people who are involved, but Syria is undoubtedly a basket case. And when you have such a situation of humanitarian crisis, a drug crisis, because Syria produces huge amounts of amphetamine called Captagon, which is also disabling the region, something is going to happen at some point.
So let's examine a few of those points that you've raised in a little bit more detail. Let's focus on Iran first. We've seen the foreign minister head to Damascus yesterday, talking about the purpose of his visit to convey the strength of Tehran's backing for Bashar al-Assad and his rule. I mean, how much does Iran want to get involved in this at the moment?
Well, it's a question of the capabilities it has, really. Iran is, people are going to show make a show of unity and support, and even Gulf states have been talking about the importance of stability. But Hezbollah, which is its main proxy force, are seriously weakened by what's been happening in Lebanon. And the question is as well, I think the forces will be watching and thinking, how much can we commit, and how worthwhile is it to commit? I mean, all the way through the Syrian war, it was clear that if at some point Assad was no longer useful, he would be potentially retired somewhere else, and a new leader chosen or allowed to emerge. I don't think that there is any particular love lost. This has been an expensive and costly and difficult war. 500,000 people have been killed, and Iran, Russia, as I said, they have their own fights to focus on now. But the situation is very fluid. That the HTS forces are advancing towards Hama and going south towards Damascus. And also, as I said, Syria is controlled by a patchwork of different forces. If they also join in, if it spreads, if other factions take territory, then what happens then? They'll need some element of unity between them. if they want to hold on to the territory, and that's quite a leap forward.
What is the chances of them actually taking back Aleppo on a more long-term basis, spreading and indeed defeating Bashar al-Assad's regime?
Well, I think to defeat a regime, you do need an element of unity. I mean, let's not forget, this is not an army. I mean, they are in some ways really well resourced, really well trained. They have some equipment that the Syrian army don't have, and I don't think anyone was expecting the Syrian army to just fold quite so quickly. But to take a country, you need more than just to hold territory. You need to hold territory in a longer term. You need to again provide services, and you need to create unity. You need to control different factions. I think we're a long way from that. But it really is a game changer. What's happened over the last few days, and at a time of international instability, it's also important to see what the regional powers say and do, and really what the international community does as well.
Well, let's speculate. Well, let's look ahead as to what might happen, because obviously, with, as you have been mentioning, the fact that the focus has been elsewhere, not least with what's happening in Gaza, what's been happening in Lebanon, and also the fact that Russia has had its own water fight in Ukraine. What could be the regional repercussions here?
Well, gosh, I mean, the region is boiling. I mean, for over a year, since October the 7th, I think the international community, certainly the US, with not so much success, has been on not letting the conflict spread. Now, the conflict has spread, and it continues to spread. And then what we're seeing here in Syria is a consequence and is a result of instability elsewhere and fighting elsewhere. I mean, I think the likelihood in Syria for now is that a vacuum develops, which is an extremely dangerous thing for a country in crisis. And it's, again, we're talking about this as if it's a game of risk. People are moving figures around a board, but the people who suffer in these situations are civilians. Civilians suffer from active conflict. They suffer from a vacuum of power, and people of Syria have suffered hugely over the last 10, 15 years. And it's dreadful to see that. And there has been some early jubilation in Aleppo, especially as we see prisoners being released. But it is dreadful to think about how that could again turn to sort of despair and civilian bloodshed.
Daniela Peled, thank you as ever for joining us on The Globalist. (9:13 a.m. in Kyiv, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has suggested a ceasefire deal could be struck if Ukrainian territory he controls could be taken under the NATO umbrella. In an interview with Sky News, the Ukrainian president said NATO membership would allow him to negotiate the return of the rest of the territory Russia occupies later in what he described as a diplomatic way. Well, I'm joined now by Adrian Karatnitsky, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of Battleground Ukraine. Welcome to the studio, Jim.
Hello, pleasure.
What is Volodymyr Zelensky meaning when he talks about the NATO umbrella and the sort of the half carving up of his country?
Well, I think what he's talking about really are ironclad security guarantees, because the thing that Ukraine fears is a settlement which would allow Russia to rearm significantly while the West does not, lags behind in allowing Ukraine to rearm significantly and to give them the capacity to protect themselves, to make themselves sort of invasion proof. I believe that most Ukrainians now, and certainly polling shows that, understand that the cost of reclaiming the land that has been taken by Russia by military means is going to be too high a price to pay in terms of blood and treasure, and in terms of the time that it would take to achieve this, even were adequate resources there, and are looking towards, say, the kind of solution that occurred with the Baltic states, which were never recognized as a part of the Soviet Union, and were in that case attained their independence, reverted to their previous status after they had been swallowed up by the Soviet Union. So I think that's sort of the thought. But nevertheless, the reclaiming of Ukraine in any means is less cannot be achieved if Ukraine, it's the territory that currently is under Ukrainian control, which is roughly 82% of the internationally recognized borders, is itself at peril. So I think he's looking to begin a discussion about what kind of security guarantees we get. And unfortunately, the NATO discussion is a little problematic because I think Donald Trump is probably a skeptic of Ukraine in NATO and even a greater skeptic of NATO itself. So I think it's more of a call to begin a discussion of what kind of bilateral, multilateral security guarantees short of NATO could give Ukraine security.
We'll touch on Donald Trump in a moment and NATO, but this seems to be a change in direction, doesn't it, for Volodymyr Zelensky, a recognition, an acceptance that they cannot push the Russians out of the land that Russia controls at the moment. And also, as you say, the use of NATO as a very strong negotiating tool.
Well, look, I think Zelensky's secret of Zelensky's success is he feels his audience. He felt his audience as a performer. He feels his audience as a political leader, and he understands public opinion. And I think public opinion began to shift in 2023 when the much vaunted counteroffensive that Ukrainians launched cost huge numbers of lives and made very, very little clear progress. So that, and also the fact that Russia is now reclaiming territory, have led to a shift where I would say today the majority of the Ukrainian population are ready for a settlement that would, freeze the current lines of contact and the current disposition of forces. And that enabled Zelensky to change his mind. He has often been loath to do the kinds of necessary things when they are unpopular. But that shift in public opinion, I think, is also important because it means that if there is an offer to be made or a deal to be struck, the Ukrainian public is more inclined to accept it rather than to be radicalized and angered by what they would formerly regard as concessions.
Ukraine has lost a huge number of men in this war. However, how ready are Ukrainians to actually lose a slice of their country to Russia and their community?
Well, look, I think, first of all, Ukrainians understand that they want, first of all, the war of attrition that Russia has waged was not just a war on the peripheries or on the line of contact. It is a war to ruin the daily life of people in the cities and in large communities. My stepdaughter, I have an apartment in Kiev, and my stepdaughter lives there permanently. This is the hardest winter she is facing, with 10-hour cuts of electricity, no water, sometimes no heat. And this goes on in major cities for hours and days at a time, and is almost the standard of the lifestyle. No internet. I mean, people use electric battery charges for rudimentary things, but really life is disrupted, transportation is disrupted, endless attacks by drones. And I think people are tired, and that leads them to this conclusion that if we can strike a deal, as long as we can hold the line of our territory, let's leave open the idea of a future negotiation or a change in Russia 10, 15, 20 years down the line where we could gain back some of this territory.
What are the chances that NATO accepts this idea of Ukraine being embraced by what he said was the NATO umbrella?
I think it's a difficult, objective. I believe that more likely are some kinds of arrangements among larger military powers and smaller military powers who are inside NATO and have the protection of NATO to extend their protection to Ukraine, at a minimum to assist in shooting down Russian missiles and Russian drones, perhaps from their own territory, without putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. So I believe that, the NATO offer is not likely, and more importantly, I believe that the NATO offer is a red flag for Putin. So if you want Putin's acquiescence in some kind of a reasonable settlement, that is unlikely to be on the table.
What message does this send to Russia?
You mean the message that NATO is not ready to accept Ukraine? Well, that message has been ongoing. It was ongoing, when NATO punked out after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, after 2014 when Russia absorbed illegally annexed Crimea through military force, though not an outright war. NATO also didn't extend an offer. And right now, many NATO countries are arguing, how can we militarily support how can we add a country which immediately puts us into a military conflict?
Finally,
so I think Ukrainians know that this is not a serious offer.
Apologies for interrupting you. Finally, we mentioned Donald Trump. How much is there a sense that there is a clock ticking here?
Well, there's a clock ticking, but it's a clock ticking, I believe, both for Vladimir Putin and for the Ukrainian side of the divide. Trump's people and Trump himself have intimated that their plan is to try to force the Ukrainians by sort of saying, look, you got to make a deal with Russia, or we're going to cut you off from the huge funding that we have provided over the last 3 years. And to Russia, they're going to say, if you don't accept this, we're going to scale up the support we give to Ukraine to make your lives miserable and to give them the capacity to end this quickly. What we want to do is to settle this and to end it quickly by both of those means. So it could be we could veer in one direction or the other direction depending on what the parties say.
Adrian Karatnitsky, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. Still to come on today's episode of The Globalist.
Ho, ho, ho.
Ho, ho, no, the Santa shortage that's hit France. We'll find out a little bit later on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:22 here in London. Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Phil Clark, Professor of International Politics at SOAS University of London. Very warm welcome back, Phil.
Good morning, Emma.
Okay, how's life in your world?
Delightfully genocidal, as always, between writing a book on Rwanda and keeping a close eye on Gaza. It's the usual delights and lightheartedness in my world.
We wish you well. Right, let's talk about the news that's broken in the last 3 or 4 hours is this pardon that Joe Biden has given his son Hunter, despite the fact that as recently, I think it's June, Joe Biden said no pardon, nothing to try to interfere with what effectively is an American judicial process. But he's now saying that the trial was unfair, that there's a miscarriage of justice, and it's all to do with politics.
That's right. This is the story, not just in the US newspapers this morning, Emma, but all over the world, that Biden has decided to pardon Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden had been convicted on federal tax and gun charges, and his sentencing was due to come up in a couple of weeks. Joe Biden described these convictions as quote, selectively and unfairly, or his son had been selectively and unfairly prosecuted, although he doesn't really explain why he thinks that. I think most observers of these cases felt that these were reasonable charges against Hunter Biden and that his convictions weren't really a great surprise. And I guess Biden will open himself up here to charges of massive hypocrisy because he's doing exactly the kind of thing that he criticized Donald Trump for doing at the end of Trump's presidency. But does show that the immense power of the US executive, that you can get your own family members off of very, very serious federal charges.
And there's an excellent article in The Times that explores this. It's an analysis by David Charter, which actually seemed to be written really quickly. It was a very strange thing. It's amazing that commentary can suddenly just appear from nowhere. But it does mention this idea that the whole point was that Biden would take the moral ground here, and that it would be a massive change from Donald Trump, who I think he pardoned the father of his son-in-law. And that man, Charles Kushner, is just about to be ambassador to France. But the whole idea is that when you have this presidential moment of pardon, that this is when the office itself is examined, isn't it, for its integrity?
Indeed. And Biden had set himself up as a kind of moral guardian compared to Trump. In many respects here, I think people are simply holding Biden to the things that he said about himself, that he wouldn't do this kind of thing in relation to his son, that he wouldn't act the way that Trump had acted, that he would respect the office, and in many respects that he would go quietly after having to leave the presidential campaign early. Well, he's doing none of these things. He's using the immense power that is in his hands to do something for a family member. I think in many respects that this will lead many people, not just in the US, around the world, but once again to become very cynical about the kind of power that many of our political elites have. I mean, there aren't many places in the world, I think, where the president can do this kind of thing, where they're, with the sweep of a pen, can simply offer a pardon to someone who a federal jury has found to be guilty. So it does seem like a gross misuse of office. And
what it does do is open up Donald Trump to all manner of fun and games once he gets in office, because he can't there's no pushback now. No, indeed. I mean, this is one of the difficulties, I think, for the Democrats, is that they're one by one losing any kind of moral ammunition that they might have wanted to use against Trump. Trump will simply turn around and say, well, you've done precisely the same thing on this kind of issue and on a range of other issues. So it does seem that the Democrats are forfeiting the moral high ground day by day. Let's move to the Democratic Republic of Congo. You wanted to draw our attention to an article in the Nile Post. Indeed. So there's been a really important set of peace negotiations going on over the last few months, and they've been ramped up in the last week or so. This is in relation to the long-standing conflict in eastern Congo. About a week ago, there was I wouldn't say a ceasefire deal, it's sort of a deal before a ceasefire deal signed between the Congolese and the Rwandan governments in Angola. But the big sticking point in this peace process has been whether the M23 rebels, which are supported by Rwanda, would come to the table and would ultimately sign a ceasefire. Well, over the weekend, there was a big push to get M23 to sign. There's a new series of peace talks going on in Tanzania, but M23 once again have refused. The Tanzanian talks saw Rwandan President Paul Kagame sit down with most of the regional leaders, and there was a great fanfare around that. There was also a hope that the Congolese President Tshisekedi would come, and he didn't. So what this looks like is at least the beginnings of a serious peace process, but it's got big holes in it at the moment. And until the Congolese government come to the table and until the M23 rebels come to the table, the fear in the region is that this will just exist on paper and won't exist in reality. Let's move to a story that's broken on Sky in the last couple of days, or actually in the last couple of hours. The Elgin marbles, the Parthenon marbles, depending on which team you're backing. It appears that the British Museum and the Greek Prime Minister have had private meetings about the possible return of the Parthenon marbles. For those of us who are not aware of this enormous story, Lord Elgin hacked bits of the Parthenon off in the 19th century, brought them back to London, where they are on beautiful, gorgeous, exquisite display in London. Greece wants it back. There we are.
Indeed. And it seems to be, if not the main reason, one of the major reasons that the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis is coming to London this week to meet with Keir Starmer. But the story, as you've mentioned, Emma, on the Sky News website this morning, is that I think, unbeknownst to most people, Mitsotakis has already had 3 private meetings with George Osborne, who's currently the chair of the British Museum and of course, the former British Chancellor. I think it's been interesting watching the right-wing press here in the UK over the last week that there seems to be a genuine sense that the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will give the green light to the Parthenon marbles being returned to Greece. I think this is something that many people thought would never happen. Starmer seems to be more favourable to this possibility. Now, the suggestion in some of the press in the last hour or two is that Osborne is pushing more for a loan of the Parthenon marbles to Greece rather than an outright return. This issue has rumbled on and actually become much more of a diplomatic break between Greece and the UK than I think anybody ever really expected. And I think it cast a huge light on stuff that was looted during the British colonial period, the kind of desire of the British establishment to cling on to stuff that other countries considered to be their own. And Greece will get its chance this week to try to get some of this stuff back.
Interesting insofar as the previous Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had actually cancelled a meeting with Kyriakos Mitsotakis last year. He believed that the collection should remain in the museum. The key to all this is George Osborne, isn't it? Because as Chancellor, he and also in his subsequent sort of quasi-political, journalistic, cultural role as editor of the Evening Standard, previous Chancellor and now head of the British Museum, the chair of the British Museum. He's got this relationship with Mitsotakis, hasn't he, that sort of unlocks diplomatic doors.
Indeed. I think it shows how much these kind of controversial issues often hinge on the particular characters who are sitting across the table. And I think in some ways it's also very clever diplomacy by Mitsotakis, who could see that certainly under the Conservatives and when Sunak was Prime Minister, there was a blockage to the return of the Parthenon marbles. But he's kind of gone through the back door, I guess. He's gone more directly to Osborne and the British Museum itself. It'll be interesting, though, to see Osborne's own view on this. He has given some indications recently that, as I said, he's more in favour of a loan rather than a return. He's also quite embattled as chair of the British Museum. The museum's been embroiled in all sorts of controversies about its funding by fossil fuel companies, the return of various other artefacts. It's a tricky time for a former Conservative Chancellor to be the head of this institution. I guess many right-leaning people in this country would think that he should be a kind of conservative custodian of the stuff in the British Museum. Be very interesting to see how he responds, and then also very interesting to see what Starmer says after his meeting with Mitsotakis tomorrow.
Finally, a very quick look at the Danish Queen, who started a podcast. Obviously, I have a royal presence, regal presence in front of me in your form, Phil. But there is a thing about how royals are now podcasting quite a lot, and this is from an Australian article.
This is The Age in Melbourne asking the question that I'm sure all listeners are asking, which is why are so many royals podcasting? That is the title of the article this morning, and they go through what I think is a quite worrying and long list of royals around the world who have decided to take up the noble art form of podcasting. Queen Mary in Denmark, Princess Eugenie in the UK, who was news to me, I must say, apparently has a long-standing podcast on the topic of modern slavery. So I will definitely be checking that out later today. Sarah Ferguson, Queen Camilla and Meghan Markle, all have podcasts. But I think the line in this article that leapt out at me the most and will give me a slight sense of serenity going into the office today is that Bloomberg has reported that Prince Harry had pitched a number of ideas for a podcast to Spotify, including a show in which he interviewed, quote, controversial guests such as Vladimir Putin, Mark Zuckerberg and Donald Trump about their early formative years. And thankfully, Spotify said they did not think there was an audience for such offerings from Prince Harry. So we may have dodged a podcast bullet on that one, Emma.
I don't know. I think that's got legs. Phil Clark, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist. The time here in London is 7:33 a.m. A quick look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. The US President Joe Biden has issued an official pardon for his son Hunter. He'd previously said he'd neither pardon him nor commute his sentence, but said he now believed politics had infected the process and had led to a miscarriage of justice. Hunter Biden was due to be sentenced on gun and tax convictions. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees says it's halting aid deliveries through the main Kerem Shalom crossing between Israel and Gaza. The head of UNRWA said the decision had been taken because 2 recent convoys had been looted by armed gangs. The chief executive of the world's 4th largest car maker, Stellantis, has resigned. The company said Carlos Tavares had stepped down with immediate effect, but didn't give a reason why. There's been a dramatic fall in sales and profits of the company. And Oxford University Press has revealed its word or phrase of the year is brain rot. There's been a significant increase in its use. It particularly describes an individual's intellectual state after consuming too much trivial material on social media. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Voters in Iceland have awarded the country's centre-left party the largest share of votes in this weekend's elections. With all votes counted, the Social Democratic Alliance have won 15 seats in the 63-seat parliament. Like so many countries experiencing elections this year, this now signifies a change in government. Well, Inga Thordar is Chief External Relations Officer at the Ocean-Born Foundation, former senior editor at the BBC and also at CNN, and she joins us on the line now from Reykjavik. A very good morning to you, Inga.
Very good morning from a very cold Reykjavik, actually, this morning.
Well, rather unsurprisingly, but this has been a snap election, hasn't it? What prompted it?
Well, it was prompted by we have had a 3-party coalition now for the last 7 years. And then earlier, about August time, one of the parties decided to finish that coalition agreement, but said that they wouldn't do it until spring. Well, that prompted the biggest party, the Independence Party, and the government to actually just call it quits because they didn't want to, operate as a minority government or as a lame duck government. So they kind of jumped the gun a bit there and asked for Parliament to be dissolved, and a snap election was called.
And just explain to us, lay out how the shape of the political field now changes following this election.
Well, it does change because there's no doubt that the previous government has fallen quite significantly, and there's a lot of people angry with some of the policies that they did. But I think that what's interesting, though, is that the biggest party, the Independence Party, it kind of held ground. It only lost 2 seats in Parliament, whereas the 2 other coalition parties lost about 8. Well, one of them was pretty much wiped out, the left. And I think what we're seeing in this election is that the left wing of Icelandic politics is pretty much gone. The left Greens have gone, the Pirates have gone. The Socialist Party didn't get a seat in Parliament. So, really politics in Iceland now is to the right or in the centre. So I think that the left movement in Iceland will now really have to sit down and think about where they stand. I think the other interesting thing here is that 34 of the 63 MPs are new. So it's a very new Parliament. With many of the people being voted out or, frankly, not standing again.
What's prompted this, not just this shift to the right, but this renewal?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a shift to the right. It's just a shift from the left to the centre, I would say. I think that there's a few things. That the 2 parties that are the biggest ones that are most likely to form the government. This is the Social Democrats you mentioned, but also the centre party called Viðreisn. They are more sort of Europe-centred. They want to have a different policy in economics. They want to, look at a little bit at inflation and interest rates are very high in Iceland. They want to look at that and really sort of focus more on the homes and the debts of the homes in Iceland. I think that's important. The third party that is going to, most likely going to be the one that props them up is very much focused on internal politics and the sort of situation of those less fortunate in society.
Tell us a little bit more, therefore, about what happens now. And you mentioned that Iceland's had a coalition for 7 years. Is this a country which has a coalition culture which can work together?
Yes, absolutely. It's a proportional representation system here in Iceland. So there's always coalition. It just depends on how big they are. Well, now it will be a bit of a horse trading. All the parties will meet the president today. The president will, most likely award the Social Democrats the right to start those discussions formally, they will call in whoever they think is best. And as I said, the best prediction now is that there's going to be those two parties I mentioned, and start horse trading, seeing what policies they can do together, what would be what the government would look at. And I suspect that anything, even if they ran on a bit of a Europe, sort of pro-Europe platform, that will take a back seat here. I don't think that Iceland is quite ready for a greater involvement with Europe. We're already in the EEA. But I think there'll be a very strong focus on energy. There'll be a very strong focus on the sort of internal economics. And I believe that this government will most likely will see it. It could take 2 or 3 weeks. So that's the sort of next steps, is to see how these parties can come together, form a coalition agreement, and start running the country.
Inga Thordal, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Reykjavik, where it's -7, I believe. You're listening to Monocle Radio. It is 8:40 a.m. in Zurich, 7:40 a.m. here in London, and 2:40 a.m. in Kingston. Now, the International Luxury Travel Market 2024 kicks off today in Cannes in France. It showcases the world's most exclusive travel destinations, accommodation and transportation options. Monocle Radio will be there all this week at our pop-up bar and studio, so if you're there, do pop by to say hello. Ahead of its launch, Monocle's Tom Webb sat down with the Jamaican Minister for Tourism, Edmund Bartlett, to talk about the importance of travel and hospitality.
It is a wonderful opportunity for an exchange of ideas, of best practices. And I say this loudly, wealth, because that's what tourism does. Tourism is the fastest way to transfer wealth in different places with different groups. Sometimes I say from the rich to the poor, but it also goes both ways, because it's all about wealth transmission. It has the fastest convertibility of all economic activities. The minute the plane flies, the dollar reaches the ordinary man. Similarly for cruise and so on. So this is also the fastest way of recovery of an economy, tourism. So whilst we talk about the vulnerabilities of tourism, and people do mention, and we are vulnerable, we are also most resilient. And we bounce back faster than all other industries. As per COVID, you would see that. Tourism is the only industry now that is fully recovered and with growth. And in the case of Jamaica, we were fully recovered from 2019 numbers in 2023. And so we're ahead now in terms of our previous, what we call pre-COVID performances. So only tourism could offer that. And the UK market for us has grown. Jamaica is now the #1 Caribbean destination for the UK tourists.
And speaking of resilience and recovery, Hurricane Beryl wreaked havoc on Jamaica. How has the bounce back been to be prepared for the next season?
Well, the bounce back had been strong because we're resilient. And for our sins, we created the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center at our university in 2018, just ahead of COVID. It really aided us in a quick recovery from COVID, but it also was powerful in helping to give us the capacity to respond fast to the hurricane that didn't really hit Jamaica, as you know. It passed by, but the outer bands were strong enough for a Category 4 hurricane to create some damages on the south coast. The north coast was fine, and most of the country, but just the south coast. But that recovery has been apace, and certainly for tourism, fully recovered. But in our Caribbean areas, we are vulnerable and we're susceptible to other weather events. And only last week, there was a slight movement of Raphael. But that, again, became a depression across Jamaica. But the power of capacity to mitigate, manage, and to recover quickly from disruptions is what Jamaica has through the Resilience Center that we established. And so it puts us in a position where we can say to tourists, we can say to visitors, feel free to come to Jamaica, because notwithstanding these disruptions, we are prepared and we are ready. We bounce back fast, and you'll be safe and you'll be secure and you'll have a seamless vacation.
We've spoken a lot about the benefits of tourism to the economy and to the country. What is the benefit to the tourist? For those looking at booking their holidays for 2025, there's a lot of options in the Caribbean. Why Jamaica?
Well, Jamaica has more attractions than all the English-speaking Caribbean combined. And the power of visits are the experiences that you consume. And we have multiple experiences. To begin with, Jamaica's food experience is the most exciting of all the Caribbean countries. This confluence of cultures and ethnicity is woven itself into a cuisine. And so there's a little piece of your palate that is in Jamaica that's waiting to be tickled by the various food types that we have. And it's true. Perhaps Jamaica jerk, for example, is one of those delectable elements that appeal to almost every single soul. It doesn't matter where in the world you're from. Then the Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee, which is premium coffee, or spices, the Jamaican herbs, and all are a very important part of this mix of elements of a cuisine that excites the palate and stimulates, the mind even. The important part of all of this too for the visitor is that it opens their thinking and widens their curiosity. They want to always know more about the flora, more about the fauna, more about the people themselves. And that, I think, is the huge attraction, the people of Jamaica. I keep saying we have 2.9 million people, and that's 2.9 gems. And so there are 2.9 gems that is there waiting for you when you come to Jamaica.
Bartlett there talking to Tom Webb. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio all week for the latest from the world of travel and tourism, from the international luxury travel market. Listen out for a very special episode of The Concierge next week. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It's time now to talk trade and economy with Vicky Price, the economist and former joint head of the UK government's economic service. She joins me on the line now. Very good morning to you. Welcome back, Vicky.
Good morning.
Let's begin with the resignation of the CEO of Stellantis. This is a big story to come out overnight, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it was unexpected, without any doubt, but perhaps not sort of hugely unexpected given what's been happening to the car industry across the world. This is Carlos Tavares, who has resigned as chief executive of Stellantis. I mean, that is of course, a company which is representing, a very large portion of the market. Just think of sort of Peugeot, Fiat, all the actual brands that are under it, including, the produced Jeeps. And the importance of it is, of course, for the UK, that also it includes what's happening with Vauxhall, one of the brands, the Vauxhall plant, of course, which has been announced to close in Luton. And that, of course, has been concerning the UK because there are 1,100 jobs there. But I think the interesting thing about the whole picture, I mean, first of all, that it was unexpected. I mean, share prices for Stellantis have been falling anyway, and there's something like 40% down in the year. The car industry in Europe is a very significant part of what is produced in the continent as well. So it's not just the UK, where cars are sort of traditionally very important export and, of course, manufacturing activity. But in Europe overall, I mean, the sector sort of employs something like 14 million people, and it accounts for something like sort of 6% of total employment. And there have been protests all across Europe because there are similar plans to close plants, across the continent, because, of course, there is huge amount of competition coming from China, in particular right now, on electric vehicles. And there are loads of regulations which various countries are putting forward. The EU itself wants to eliminate the sale of fossil fuel powered cars by 2035. The UK had also done the same. It extended its own guideline under the previous government from 2030 to 2035. Now, this new government wants to bring it back down to 2030. The industry is concerned. They can't compete. And the question is, of course, what happens next in terms of both the UK but also Europe in the competitive environment that exists, tariffs being imposed and possibly mooted by the EU as well against the Chinese imports of EVs. The UK hasn't quite done that yet, but the whole trade environment is worsening, and the car industry is right in the middle there, very important, and suffering.
Let's move on. You mentioned the word tariffs, which immediately leads us to a story about Donald Trump and his incoming administration, and tariffs being an absolutely key part of this. There's a threat of 100% tariffs against BRICS nations. I mean, the numbers just keep going up in terms of the percentage that Trump wants to levy against various countries, but 100% against the BRICS nations now.
Well, I presume this is 100% additional, as you rightly point out, to the 10 to 20% he wants to impose on everything, the 60% he wants to impose on China, and then, of course, all the sanctions that already exist in a number of countries, or against a number of countries, if you like, which, of course, include Russia, which is very much part of this BRICS group. Now, this BRICS group, which was originally, as probably people remember, made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then because of the S they added South Africa, has been extended quite considerably in terms of its presence. There was a recent meeting in Russia itself with a number of other countries being interested in joining, and some actually already having done so, such as Egypt, the UAE, Ethiopia, and Iran. And there are other countries like Turkey and more, and many more, something like 20 other countries interested in joining. Now, the question is, how can they manage their trade, given that for the moment, at any rate, the dollar is the dominant currency, which is being used for trade, for foreign exchange transactions and everything else. What Trump is worried about is that there's going to be an alternative system. Some of the countries that I mentioned are already excluded from the SWIFT payment system of the West, which is, of course, particularly Russia. Concerns, of course, with trade with China. There are suggestions that rather than just thinking of another currency like the Chinese currency perhaps being the dominant one in the future, what they might do is move to a digital form of transactions, which means that it's going to be much easier for them to trade between themselves. And what Trump is saying, that if there is indeed a change away from the dollar to something else, which I think is a digital one that worries him in particular, then he will be imposing extra tariffs for any of the countries that intend to use that system or playing part in the development of it. So, yes, I mean, there is no end to this threat of tariffs, and you're absolutely right. And of course, as we discussed just earlier, electric vehicles have been right in the center of this. And of course, for many, it's a bit of a worry because loads of the supplies that are going into electric vehicles, whether you import the actual finished product from China, or whether you are trying to manufacture it yourself and have lots of batteries, which are depending on lithium, for example, which comes from China, you're beginning to wonder about what's going to happen to the world economy and trade after Trump gets to be president in January.
A very quick question finally, Vicky. Do Black Fridays work?
What an interesting question to ask, given what's been happening all across the world. I've just come back from Greece and Turkey. Well, Black Friday in Greece, I can tell you, is big. And I was there on Friday when that day was happening. But of course, what happens now is that there are sales throughout November. Maybe they cut a little bit more at the end of the month, but in reality, it's another sales period. And what we've seen here in the UK is that, yes, of course, there was quite an increase in demand towards the last few days of November. But the month itself has not been particularly good. People obviously are much more careful with their money. But the fact that there is another sales period added to all the other ones, it's not bad for consumers, but what it does to profit margins for retailers is another matter.
Vicky Price, thank you so much for joining us. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally, France is being hit by an unusual shortage this winter, a lack of people willing to play the role of Father Christmas in schools, shopping centres and local businesses. Ungrateful parents and nasty children have left events agencies scrambling to find actors willing to play the role. One particular case in 2020 saw a Santa in Blois quit on the spot because angry parents told him to go back to the North Pole. Well, Samantha T is a writer and editor and consultant who joins us on the line now from Paris. A very good morning to you, Samantha.
Good morning.
This sounds awful.
It is kind of awful because, having time with Santa is a very big part of the Christmas experience or the holiday experience. It's a very big part of the retail experience. And that's definitely going to, it's going to affect how people view, I don't necessarily view Christmas, but how they view the retail experience during the holiday season.
So tell us a little bit about what we mentioned a moment ago, like nasty parents and bratish children. I mean, just outline the situation a bit more for us, would you please?
Yeah, so definitely there have been a shortage of Santas, partly because there's a very specific profile of person who can actually be Santa. And, the long hours required and to always be on character, to always be jolly, always be happy. It can be quite trying. And I know that in the past they have actually worked with a lot of retired retired gentlemen to be Santa, but long hours and demanding children. And, there was even an incident where a child urinated on a Santa. It's a lot to ask of someone to do, I guess. And so it's been kind of difficult all around the country. Agencies have been recruiting since, or trying to recruit since October, and it's not been that successful, unfortunately.
You've just left us with an image that I don't think we're going to shake off anytime soon. I mean, the fact that people are saying that parents are getting nastier and children are getting more bratish, is that true? Or is that Santas are getting a little bit more sensitive?
I think it's a combination of both, to be honest. I think definitely, post-pandemic, people are a little bit more cautious about being in such close contact with, so many different people. And I think, having gone to the shops myself this weekend in France, I definitely think that it's people are a little bit more aggressive than they have been in the past. So, I don't know if it's shortage of time. I don't know if it's like, weather changes, but I have noticed that people are a little bit more, they have a little bit less patience. And to be a good Santa, you definitely need a lot of patience, and queues are getting longer and kids are getting more impatient. There's just such a demand.
There's also the issue that France is I think it's the slimmest country in Europe, at least. And Santa does not necessarily fit that mold. I mean, is there a fear that perhaps that there is a lack of people who are naturally going to fit the shape and the prerequisite that Santa has to be, that maybe Santa's been sort of like dipping into the Ozempic while no one's looking?
I definitely think that, it is a slimmer nation, but in terms of like what the profile of Santa, I think definitely with a bit of like clever costuming, that can be solved. The issue of whether or not the Santa is, soft enough, if you will, I don't think that's a huge problem. I think like I said, that can be sorted with some costuming, but definitely, trying to find someone who's happy to be Santa, be jolly, be on for so many hours, for so many weeks. Christmas is something, seeing Santa is a part of the tradition. And I know that, some places, for example, in Cardiff, they've had to shut down one of the grottos in the center of the city because there is no Santa. And right now, I think part of the way that France is trying to resolve it is if they can't find Santa, they just tell the kids that he's busy in the workshop, which I think is clever but disappointing.
Samantha Say, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Paris. And don't worry, if you are coming to London's Monocle Christmas Market on the 14th to 15th of December, we have long resolved this delicate issue. We import our own Santa directly from Rovaniemi in Finland. If you want quality, you go straight to the source. That is all the time, though, we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Vincent McAviney, Tom Webb and Monica Lillis. Our research was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Steph Chungu, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, thank you so much for listening and have a good week.